Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything. Long before words, before language shaped thought, silence was the original communication, the language of the soul. True mystics didn't speak much, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had touched a state where words no longer served. In sacred silence, awareness sharpens. The noise of the world fades. You begin to hear something deeper, the subtle hum of your own consciousness aligning with the universe. This is why spiritual masters retreat into caves, mountains, and deserts, not to escape, but to listen. Because in silence, guidance emerges. The mind ceases its chatter, and the truth that always existed underneath is finally heard. Silence, then, is not passive. It is an active tuning, a deliberate reattunement to the divine current that flows through all things. In many ancient traditions, silence wasn't just a virtue, it was a sacred practice. In Hermetic texts, silence was considered the gateway to true knowledge because the inner world speaks in frequencies, not words. The moment you become still, a shift begins. Your awareness stops leaking outward and turns inward. The senses relax. The ego loses its grip. And what remains is a deeper self, a presence that doesn't need validation, noise, or identity. From this space, real transformation happens. That's why in Egyptian mystery schools, initiates would be required to spend days in complete silence before being given esoteric teachings. The silence purified their perception. In yogic sciences, too, the practice of mauna, voluntary silence, is said to activate higher chakras and open the third eye. The silence isn't empty. It's full of codes, full of subtle guidance. If you learn to enter it with reverence, it will whisper the truths you've been seeking from books and teachers for lifetimes. But here's what most people miss. Silence doesn't mean absence. It's a field of presence. And when you enter it consciously, you step into a dimension where energy becomes audible. In deep silence, your inner noise, the constant chatter of the mind, starts to dissolve. This opens a space where subtle energies can speak. Thoughts that aren't yours become obvious. Intuitions rise from below the surface. And this is where the real power begins, in the recognition that most of what you thought was you was simply noise. Monks and mystics discovered this long ago. That's why practices like silent retreats or meditative fasting are less about discipline and more about revelation. The longer you remain in intentional silence, the more the ego's illusions fall away, and soon you start hearing your soul clearly, not in words, but in resonance. It's not about silencing the world, it's about turning the volume up on your own forgotten wisdom. If this resonated with something deep inside you, don't just watch and forget. Subscribe now, because this is just the beginning of your inner awakening. Silence also holds a magnetic charge. It draws to you what noise repels. In the spiritual realm, like attracts like, and the stillness within you becomes a signal to the stillness of the universe. Have you ever noticed how animals approach a quiet human, or how clarity comes only after the noise ends? That's not coincidence. It's a law of energy. The more still you become, the more your field aligns with higher dimensions. Silence is not passive. It's receptive. It absorbs insights from the cosmos, healing from the unseen, and alignment from the divine. In ancient initiatory schools, silence was a prerequisite for revelation. Words can veil, but silence reveals. Mystics would often say that God speaks most clearly not through thunder, but through silence. And when you learn to rest there, to listen without needing to respond, you begin to receive messages that have no language but feel more real than speech. This is the dimension where true transformation begins. Begin with 3 minutes of intentional silence each morning or evening. Sit upright, eyes closed, spine straight, and breathe naturally. As thoughts arise, don't chase them. Allow them to drift like leaves on water. After 1 minute, inwardly note, I am silent. At minute 2, I receive. At minute 3, I transcend. This is not self-hypnosis, it's reconditioning. With daily practice, your system begins to expect silence, not noise, between stimuli. Over time, you'll notice small shifts. Your inner dialogue softens, your emotional reactions ease, and intuition becomes sharper. At home, phone off, Walk barefoot on the earth for a minute. Feel the silence beneath your feet. In crowded spaces, simply stop speaking or listening for 30 seconds. Let ambient sounds recede. In those moments, you reclaim a sacred space. These micro-practices are the roots of deeper silence. Eventually, you'll recognize silence not as a lack of words, but as a field of awareness. You begin to live less in reaction, more in resonance. Each silent breath becomes a portal to presence. Silence is not just the absence of noise, it's a gateway to your unconscious mind. In the depths of true silence, when the mind stops reaching and the ego loses grip, something ancient stirs. The subconscious begins to rise, offering glimpses of forgotten truths and hidden symbols. This is why silence has always been sacred in mystery schools, because it grants access to the forbidden libraries of the inner world. Words distract, but silence reveals. The spiritual masters knew that within prolonged stillness, the veil between dimensions grows thin. You begin to hear not with your ears, but with your energy. You receive not with logic, but with intuition. This is where true revelation begins, not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet within. When you sit in silence long enough, reality itself begins to rearrange around your awareness. You stop reacting, you begin listening, and what you hear isn't sound. It's knowing, direct knowing, beyond language, beyond thought, the ancient voice of consciousness whispering through the void. In silence, the ego begins to dissolve. With no noise to react to, no audience to impress, the mind loses its usual stage. It fidgets at first, uncomfortable without the validation of thought or sound. But if you stay with the silence long enough, something incredible happens. The deeper self emerges. Not the personality you perform, but the raw awareness beneath it all. Ancient mystics described this space as the inner sanctum, where the divine voice speaks without words. It's here that silence reveals its true nature, not absence, but presence. Stillness becomes the language of the soul, and you begin to hear what was always there, but drowned in noise. Practice sitting in this kind of silence daily, even for just a few minutes. Not passive waiting, but active listening, to nothing and therefore to everything. The more you tune in, the more guidance you'll receive, but not as words, as knowing. In this sacred stillness, silence no longer feels like emptiness. It becomes a container for presence. You may notice that insights arise without you thinking, that emotions resolve themselves without a story. This is the power of being fully attuned. From this space, true intention emerges, not from the mind, but from a place that feels like it existed before words. And what you birth from this silence carries a different frequency. It doesn't strive, it resonates. This is why mystics treated silence as initiation. To cultivate this, create a ritual of entering silence daily. Light a candle, sit in stillness, and observe. Let your breath anchor you, and each exhale take you deeper into yourself. Over time, silence won't just be a space you enter. It will become your natural state. And in that state, reality bends. Not because you control it, but because you're finally aligned with what was never separate from you, the sacred. Do you think silence is just absence of sound? Or could it be the very language of the divine?